Yes, here we are. Okay. For the next 20-some minutes, when I put my hat on, I'll be in character. At the end of about a 20-minute presentation, I'll take questions as either Mr. Henry Schoolcraft or Rick Mansfield, the guy hatless. Okay? All right. How many here know who Henry Schoolcraft? You're not going to sit there and listen to music, are you? That's just rude. That's close to throwing tomatoes at people, but not as messy. How many here know who Henry Schoolcraft was? He's dead now. See, okay, that's kind of sad. Most of what we know about the Missouri Ozark is because of Henry Schoolcraft. He was Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. His mother's family, the Rowes, had money, and that was enough to make him look over there at his mother's family and think, I'd like to have money. 20 minutes, I can't tell you everything, but he and his father had a failed glass business. So he set out, like a lot of young people did, to start in the 19th century to seek a fortune. Some went up to the Yukon looking for gold. Some went out on the East Coast and pursued whales. He found himself in St. Louis, Missouri, and the traveling companion he came across was 37 years old, Levi Pettibone, also from New York. You see, you meet a guy named Levi Pettibone, what do you want? Just get on a barge and have an adventure. They found themselves in what was called Montreton, and it would later become Potosi, in the late summer of 1818. And Mr. Austin did not need any help. He was mining and doing quite well, much to the chagrin of his neighbors. Imagine, I don't know what you know about lead mining, but timber business, I grew up in timber business, Rick Mansfield. Imagine somebody coming into your area and buying a bunch of just lands with stumps and saying, I'm putting in a sawmill. Well, you'd sell him your land and laugh all the way to the bank. Then imagine 5 years later, he's filthy rich. Well, mining be a little different. Lead had been mined in what would become known as Potosi for 100 years. But what they didn't know, Moses Austin was not a fool. He had come across a German that had a better way of smelting. And so he bought all this land, and they just kept laughing, until he set up a new, different-looking smelter. He smelted their slag piles and got more lead than they did the first time. So he wasn't having to pay anybody to dig it. And so he became quite wealthy. So by the time Mr. Schoolcraft and his companion came along, he said, tell you what, I'm good here. But supposedly to the west, there's lead deposits. And if you can find them, secure some kind of agreement, we maybe even become business partners or something. So he and Levi started to set out, but they couldn't hire anybody because everybody, and I'll go in between characters, but I'll give you a synopsis real quick. Everybody at that point in this area, and this was literally prehistoric Ozarks. They weren't even using the term Ozarks yet. And this was still a territory. We were 3 years short of becoming a state. Everything just about an hour away from Montreton was wilderness. And horror stories about the Osage is kind of like the boogeyman. The Osage will kill you. So he was going to leave after the leaves fell anyhow, because keep in mind, he's looking for minerals, and the best way you can see minerals is if your view is not obstructed by tree leaves. But he meant to leave long before November 6th, but he couldn't hire anybody, so he finally Levi, and a pack horse named Butcher took off. Now, here's where they would finally find the lead deposits. And at this time, lead was being superficially mined. A 15-foot hole was a deep lead mine, much like the early coal mines in the 19th century. Later, of course, we would go down back in this area. Those of you familiar with Missouri, go down 1,000 feet and all sorts of lead. When he got here, the lead had been being mined for about 1,000 years by the Osage, who laid claim to it, and what few people there were around, which were few, said, you don't want to mess with the Osage. So they finally came back down, came home. Now, you're wondering what this has to do with the Hawken rifle. Same time period, but it actually does have a tie, and I'll go into character in a second or so and do it. But they got lost, came down here. The lead was here. They came down here and they met two gentlemen. Fisher Holtz were the farthest people to the west on the White River. By 1818, you had a settlement about every 10 to 20 miles, but they were the farthest west. They told them that, yes, we can take you to that lead you're talking about, but we have a bunch of stuff to do first. Because they could tell by Mr. Schoolcraft's demeanor that he wasn't one to be taught, for lack of a better term. He had attended some college. He very self-taught, a very intelligent man, very Christian man, but it didn't always show, both the spirituality and the intelligence. So they kept him here, and in his journal he wrote about you could see mist over there to the west in the valleys. What wasn't mist, it was smoke from the Osage burning off their hunting ground before they went back to their winter camp in Oklahoma. Had Fisher and Holt not found them, or they found Fisher and Holt, had they not detained them until the Osage had left, there'd be no book to talk about because they'd have killed them. Now later in his books, and he wrote about this twice. He wrote about it once, and then about 12 years, 15 years later, he wrote about it again. He did that a lot. He published 30-some books in his life, but a lot of them would have pieces of earlier books. But he 15 years later, so he's a 40-some-year-old man, he's still mocking the Osage fear. As he wrote in one of the first book, they were killing farmers and trappers. I'm not a farmer, I'm not a trapper, what did I have to worry about? By then, the Osage hated the whites, so they'd have killed them for target practice. And they hated them with good reason. The Osage, if they killed a deer, they ate every bit of it. They used the hide. They used the bones to make tools. Schoolcraft would hire a guy named Roberts to kill him some camp meat. He killed 12 deer knowing full well he's just going to use one of them. And the Osage would come up and see these things. And so anyhow, I'm going to go into, I'm 25 years old. And, no, I'll tell you what, nobody's falling for that already. Anybody here think I'm 25? Even the gal with the ear thing, she doesn't know. So, I'll be 60, we're going to go to 1860, and I will be roughly 50-some years old, less than 10 years from dying. So here we go. Henry Schoolcraft, glad to meet you. I'm going to talk a little about an adventure that I took several years ago, and it was something. I found a Mr. Austin whose son went on to even more fame, and those of you from here, Texas, and the 300, that would be Stephen, that would be Moses' son. But he hired me and my companion to go west, and we did go west. And had many, in my book that you can find, had many wonderful adventures, but the one that might be more correlated to this crowd is my weaponry. I grew up around money, grew up well-read, attended some college, planned on being either a geologist or a cartographer. Went out to seek my fortune, and I came down to Missouri, in what is now called the Ozarks. We didn't have that term then. Nobody heard that term 1818. But I thought, well, if I can find that lead, Mr. Austin and I will work out a deal. If I can't, I'll write a travel book, which were becoming kind of popular in the early 19th century, early 1800s. And my backup plan, if that didn't work, would be that I would become the territorial mine superintendent, because I knew a great deal about minerals, loved rocks. So it didn't work out. The lead thing, they're still in, can you believe, 1860s. There are people out west still afraid of the Osage. I can't get it. But I did publish a book, sent copies to the President of the United States, sent several copies, got put on an expedition shortly after that to find the origin of the Mississippi River, and ended up actually up here north. And as a lot of you know now, here it is, 1860. I've got things named after me. I helped start the Historical Society in one state, one territory, published a set of books, two good women in my life, and without denigrating either, because two wonderful women, but very different. My first wife was actually a quarter full Indian. And as many of you might know about the lawsuit, and I rode Hiawatha. This guy comes along, puts it in a poem, sells thousands of copies. Of course, I sued him. Uh, but in full disclosure, I wrote about Hiawatha after my wife told me about Hiawatha. So she should have got some credit. She gave me 3 wonderful children. She passed away. I would remarry a woman and found a whole genre of literature of which I had not been familiar. And here we are, and it's amazing how emotional people can get when they could read. I've already got 5 books published about rocks and geography. I've got several more published about Indian culture. But right now, the 2 hottest books being sold on the eastern part of the United States are what's called the Uncle Tom genre, based on, of course, Uncle Tom, but they turned it into a play, very popular in the North. But in the South, where my wife's from, they had a genre that was the exact opposite. It was talking about how wonderful it was to be a slave. And she was one of the leading authors of that. And so you go down south, you can't hardly find a copy of Uncle Tom. Not in 1860. But you could find this. Wonderful wife, and made a lot of mistakes in my life. And towards the end, the only reason I completed this 6-volume of Native Americans in this continent was with her help. But thinking back on that, that started it all. I mean, now, I've been recognized by numerous geological societies, numerous historical societies for my work up Michigan and with the Indians. But it all started with this adventure going into what became known as the Ozarks, looking for lead that didn't pan out with Mr. Levi Pettibone. And so, considering the artillery-minded crowd today, I bought one of the best fowling pieces that you could buy in New York. Passed right through St. Louis, where they would sell lots of guns. In fact, there were prototypes of the famous guns becoming available then. But I was very content with what I'd bought until about 2 weeks out on the trail. And I just kept shooting at and watching bears and elk and even white-tailed deer run away. And I was cognizant of what was happening. Those little fine pellets that would kill a pheasant or a quail at 30 or 40 feet weren't bringing down a bear at 100 yards. Now, I know in 1860 we're pretty civilized, but in 1818 we encountered bears on the camp, and you don't want 30 feet from a black bear and trying to kill it with shot. The rudest thing that happened to me, and I know it's 1860 and we're becoming more proper, but still women have their place, we know that. And I'd been on the trail 10 days, came to a cabin, and much to my still, years later, shock, this woman looks at the 2 of us, and the first words out of her mouth, "You've got the wrong kind of weaponry. You need a rifle." Well, she was right. I knew it then, and certainly within the next few weeks I knew it, but that still stands out. That still stands out. Another day that kind of stood out in this adventure was when, like I said, we had kind of wandered off path. We found the Fisher and Holt family, and they kept us there with one silly chore after another. I don't know what it was, but we were shingling a barn. We were going down to a neighboring village to buy corn. I did, and I hope this isn't hubris, but I'm very good at a multitude of things, including being a cook. And so for Christmas Day, now keep in mind, 1818, even 1860, but 1818, Christmas wasn't celebrated that big. But I had sent one of them out, and you can read my book, but to give you an idea of the multitude of game, I said, if you'll kill a turkey, I'll make turkey pie for Christmas. And I made a most beautiful cornmeal crust, but that native corn was red. So for Christmas, had that beautiful red crust. They came back in less than 3 hours with 14 turkeys. That's the multitude of game that existed. So I remember that. And in my book, probably the saddest, those of you that are students of the Bible, shortest verse, Jesus wept. And all of us that went through any kind of a Christian upbringing know that for this reason. At some time or another, little kids are told, you got to memorize a verse. Well, that's the one to key on. Jesus wept. Probably the saddest line in my And thanks to Mr. Pettibone building the campfires, setting up her tent and everything, I was able to spend a lot of my time at night completing the journal. So it's a very inclusive. But Mr. Fisher and Mr. Smallin took me up a creek, and we were walking up that creek, and all of a sudden, we rounded a corner. It looked, I don't want to say anything to offend my Lord, but it's almost like I was privy to creation. It just looked like a mountain opened up in a huge cave. And we got to walk in there, and I found cave pearls and found myriad of things. But at the end of 1 hour, Fisher and Holt looked up and said, we need to be going. So in my journal, I penned the following, not as dramatic as Jesus wept, not as soul-changing, but still to me, heart-wrenching. We spent but an hour in the cave. I would go on to spend 3 months. I'd already spent my life wandering around New York, the early 1800s. I was born at the end of the 18th century. And all these geological wonders that I saw, that we spent but an hour there. So I'll remember that day. I remember when we came into Polk Bayou and Widow Lafferty opened up her home and we got to eat with them and spend the night inside. I remember where Mr. Pettibone left me up here because, as he said, you promised we'd be home at Christmas, and this is well into January. And so he went on his way because at this junction he could go to St. Louis rather than Potosi, so he left what was being called then an Arkansas Trail because Arkansas Territory. I remember crossing the ferry. And I hadn't done that most of the time. Of course, most of the time there was no civilization. We would literally back, and of course this almost 50 years ago, but we would go for weeks without seeing another human being. That's a different feeling. But the latter part of my journey was almost totally different. There are people camped out homes about every 10 to 20 miles, and we're in a canoe going much faster. And then this was, like I said, called the Arkansas Trail. So there were homes about every 10, 12 miles on that. But we came to a river to cross, and I felt, I knew I was, I'd lost Mr. Pettibone. So I thought I'm going to hire the ferry, and they told me what it cost, and I got my coin out. And being a good steward of my resources, I said, can you make change? This gentleman said, sure. He takes my coin, puts it on a stump, takes a camp axe, whacks it in two. He said, that's the Kentucky way. I didn't argue with him whether or not I got the right side of right size of the coin. Anyhow, that's Henry Schoolcraft. Now, Rick Mansfield, I started doing this about 10 years ago. 2018, 2019 was actually the 200-year anniversary. A dear friend of mine, Dave Toby, said, you ought to recreate that walk. I said, Henry was 25. I'm 40 years older. Now, here was Mr. Toby's argument. He said, you got a wife or kids? You got a wife, kids, a dear one. If you take them to the hospital, do you want some kid waiting on them, or do you want a guy seasoned? Do you want the best? Or at least somebody with maturation, with experience. I said, well, yeah, I'm going to opt probably. You go in the barber shop. You don't get the kid. You get the old guy. He said, well, do you want to set out on a 900-mile walk on 25-year-old legs? Kids' legs? Your legs have 40 more years of experience. Think about it. This will be easy. So I'm just going to give you some highlights, and then I'll take questions as either Henry or, sadly, this is just a private gripe I'll share real quick. I've been doing this trying to bring attention to Henry Schoolcraft because much of what we know is because of his journal. He sent copies to numerous people, sent them back in England, sent them to our United States president at the time, hoping to, like I say, get a signed superintendent of mining for the territory of Missouri, and then later for the state of Missouri. Didn't get any of that, but his book was basically lost. Whole pages. I don't have it now, but a Dr. Nishaw in college in 70-something at College of the Ozarks, there was like 3 pages, and I remember now I'm pointing it out. This is straight out, it's not credited, but this is out of a book written in the 1800s. But the minute, like if you told me something, sir, very profound, which I'm sure you could, but if I later tell her and I don't have your name, I can't credit you. So he was basically lost till 1955. The University of Arkansas decided to resurrect some of the old important books, and they republished that. And then in 1978, I believe, a Dr. Rafferty at what's now Missouri State University, but was SMS at Springfield, was a geography and history professor, and he took people on different parts of the walk, and he wrote a book called Route Pursuits and Rugged something rugged. But anyhow, you can still buy that book, Dr. Rafferty, and I encourage people to buy it. It's a neat book, and it's got the original text in its entirety. It just has some additions at the front, kind of telling you about area. And then in the text itself, it will have a footnote, and like what he called Elkhorn Springs, you can visit today, but it's called Topaz Springs. So we should know about this, but just somewhere between 7 or 8 years ago, $300 million your tax dollar redid the arch display. Now, a big part of it was the mechanics, I'm sure, of the ride. But a big part, if any of you have been there, they totally redid the basement museum. And the theme, Explorers of Missouri. And so we're talking like 2016 or 17. No Henry Schoolcraft. Yeah, that's ridiculous. Anyhow, here's Levi was 25, Pettibone was 37. That's obviously my 16-year-old niece, and she walked a few miles with me. This document, if it didn't get flooded a few years ago, was actually a 1600s map from Spain that they have actually been mining. 1700s, I apologize. 1700s map from Spain. They've actually been mining lead at what became known as Potosi from the 1600s somewhat. Unbelievable. Yeah. Okay, here we go. There's the map you've been staring at. There's Moses Austin Camp, they call it Durham Hall. There's the furnace that made him very wealthy. He wasn't paid by the word. Charles Dickens, kind of a side note, actually was paid when he serialized many of his books by the word. Hence if you've ever read Charles Dickens, lots of words. He wasn't paid by the word, but still the title, Journal of a Tour into the Interior of Missouri and Arkansas from Potosi or Manawatu in Missouri Territory in a southwest direction toward the Rocky Mountains. Performed in the years 1818, 1819. That's the title. I begin my tour where other travelers have ended theirs, and that's what you really need to, when you think about this journey. There had been very few white people, and taking nothing away from Lewis and Clark, but when in 1804, when they went west, they didn't cover any of what that map just showed you. They did a lot for this country and opened up a lot of things, gave us a lot of knowledge, but Missouri wasn't one of them. Where are we on time, darling? Okay. As we are unacquainted with the hunters traveling, and these are just some right out of his journal himself, he found himself with a hunt difficulties. Like 2 different nights, he forgot to hobble his horse. So the next morning, instead of starting off at 10, shortly after daylight, he was 2 or 3 hours finding the horse. And it took him 2 or 3 times doing that to finally figure out, I need to hobble the horse at night. This is, any of you familiar with it, this is Ashley Creek. I think there's a presentation next maybe about William Ashley Creek. He spent 3 days in Ashley Cave. He was our first lieutenant governor, by the way. He stayed there because of the rain. Mr. Ashley wasn't there at the time, but he had been there. Old Prescott Road. Somebody asked earlier if any of the trails left. Some of these trails were Indian trails or game trails that he followed, and very often game find the best ways. The Indians used it. Later, smart white people used it. Over the years, some of them became roads. One of them became known as the Old Prescott Road. That's down there between Licking and Houston. Jody Hamilton. Interesting story. I don't have time to tell you other than they hung him twice. This is one of the places he realizes he needed a rifle. This was, and I've actually got a canebrake on my farm so we could reenact that. And that is, if you've never tried to get, and at one time he actually abandoned his horse, turned him loose, because they couldn't get through the canebrake with the horse. And they had no machetes, I guess, or, just. This is, I'm talking about, this spring's there today. He hung Elkhorn on it, called it Elkhorn Spring. You can visit this today. I think it's private property, but it's very accessible, and it's Topaz Springs, and a little community grew up around it, and it's gone now. But the building's still there. Like a lot of little communities back then, it even had had its own little barber in the general store. This was, I think, close to November 21st was where he carried a staff similar to this one. And I know now we have a lot of wonderful aluminum tools, but cedar staffs are hard to beat for a multitude of reasons. They float if you drop them. They're strong. They're light. Also, you can scrape enough off of them most nights to tinder a fire. You know, but he didn't use it that day like he should have. I don't want to lean in on a boat. He, even though Levi said, I think that's deeper than you think, no, he stepped out into about 10 foot of water thinking he was stepping into 2 foot of water. And so his clothes got wet, the pack horse didn't drown, but all sorts of, it was a real setback. They lost a lot of their powder, lost a lot of Levi Pettibone's tea. 22nd, that was Potato Cave, I think, hard to find. I'm kind of skipping ahead. Had some really neat moments. The trip, unlike some people at church that approached my wife and said, oh my goodness, aren't you worried your husband's going to die because I'd gone white-headed? No, I'd bleached my hair because I also do Santa Claus. But when they last saw me at church, I was dark-haired. And then they saw some of these pop up on Facebook because, we this morning finished the last morsel of provisions, ate a red-headed woodpecker. He did not comment on whether or not it tasted like chicken. We do not know. Been without meat, and this comes in important here in a minute because he was a very religious man in his writings. And I haven't read all 30-some books, but I've read probably 20 of his works. Been without meat or bread for several days. Finds the Beaver Creek settlement. That's the Holt and the Fishers. He's griping about the chores in the book. Making shingles, among others, employed in chopping wood, clearing land, or bill of fare. Now look at this. Now if you'll remember, less than a week ago, he was starving to death. No food. Hadn't eaten for 3 days. The last thing he ate was a woodpecker. Our bill of fare contains no variety, hominy, and bear's bacon, no vegetables. These people take him in, feed him, and so he takes the time to write in his journal that there was no real variety and no vegetables. So that's the contrast to him. He was a religious person, but he just couldn't see the blessings that are around him. He couldn't see God's hand that saved him numerous times. And much of much of Hollywood would go on and portray hillbillies as dirty people, dogs under the porch and all that, came from his first early writings that were later plagiarized and repeated, and that's what people thought all hillbillies were. We tried to replicate what we could. This is back at my farm, but we used the old tools to make shingles. See, again, still griping. Schools unknown, no species of learning cultivated. Now, they knew how to build cabins. They knew how to store bee honey in the intestines of animals they'd killed, that they'd cured. They knew how to make clothing out of the skins. They knew enough to have saved his life. But in his mind, no species learning cultivated. That's a hill still there today, uses a marker. I'm going fast, and I apologize. I'm leaving Finley's Fork, followed up. Anybody here ever been to Smalling Cave near Springfield? It is amazing. That's the cave that he discovered and he looked up. He described it. He got the big eye. He thought in his book, he guessed at dimensions and he overguessed about twice. So if you read his book, it hadn't shrunk. He just overguessed. But it is, and the people that own Smalling Cave, when I recreated this, most of the book, it's day by day. Here's what you've seen my entries. So as I went out and replicated this walk 200 years to the day, majority of the time, I was exactly where he was. The only times I weren't, there was a few kind of vague, like it took me 2 or 3 tries to find Potato Cave. Then Ashley Cave, I couldn't get permission, and Ashley Cave owners have actually taken it off. If you go to Raleigh and spend like $50 to get one of those quadrangle maps, it doesn't have Ashley Cave. Because they petitioned the government, they just got tired of drunks partying in their cave. And so it's been off, and you need a map prior to like 72, I think. So I had trouble getting permission. you'll see a thing. Well, I think I've passed it. We were there that day, and we were close, but it was opening weekend of deer season, and the bullets started hitting way too close to us, and we didn't know if it's just errant shots or somebody was, like, I'm going to shoot you. It's getting closer. So we quit. Okay, I've got to quit soon. Anyhow, the owners actually if you go visit the cave, it's a living cave. They have walkways. But he actually let me replicate the walk and come up that stream. So I got to see it like Schoolcraft and Pettibone saw. In fact, a young man, I can't think of his name, but he actually is their resident Schoolcraft. But for my portrayal, he played Levi Pettibone since I was being Schoolcraft. Wonderful young man. Small and Cave, we spent about an hour in. Sad words. Valley of the Cave, there it is now. It's got all these sorts of things. Don't even think about it, but he actually let me climb this because in the book the guy was on it, and he's got pictures of all that. This is just a sad footnote. You'll see there were lead works there, and the lead works near there later. I understand Dr. Bob Kipfer. Google Dr. Bob Kipfer saving a Bull Creek. I understand that he's writing a book about it. But I got to walk on that road, which I walked that road at night. The very same road they brought. What was the killer's name? Oh, right there it says Alf Bolin. Alf Bolin hung out at those rocks for probably 10 years murdering people. Not those rocks, some rocks up towards in Christian County. They killed him, cut his head off for proof, put it in a basket, and they brought it down that road at night, hoping not to encounter any of his friends, but they had just his head in a basket. That's kind of spooky walking down through there, even though I didn't have Alf's head, and finally came back to the place. Now let me see if this is going to work. It might not. If it does, it's hilarious. No. The video is not working. This is my niece walking with me one day, and this is where they actually loaned, because of a huge curve in the river, they loaned their canoe to Mr. Hawken to transport a bunch of goods, and they just walked across country. They got there, and Mr. Hawken wasn't there yet. So we replicated that walk and everything, of course. Of course, there was no boat. And I asked her, "You're having fun?" And she very vehemently, "No, I want to go home." It topped out at, I think, 11 degrees that day. And we walked 10 miles that day, and she was 16. So she truly, when I said, "You're having fun, right?" "No, but I can't get that to animate sometimes. I'm just not smart enough. I apologize." Calico Rock, Pittman's Ferry. Sometimes I knew that I was in the same valley. Sometimes I knew I was exactly the same place, like Jacob's Ladder in that cave. But also here, in his book, he writes that when he's at Hicks Ferry, it was called then, that he's beside a 100-year-old oak resting in the shade. 200 years later, that's the 300-year-old oak. So there were numerous times I knew I was in, and that's a neat feeling. That's a neat feeling. Here's another time, and this is just how he thinks. That's where the Kentucky ways where they cut that. And just kind of an interesting side note, I did a presentation down there where this happened a few years ago during some kind of festival. So I thought how cool it'd be. I was just in character, and I got out a coin and I cut it. It went flying off into the audience, and before it finally missed everybody, I could just see, blind the guy, lawsuits, family farm, going to a lawyer, So I don't demonstrate the cutting the coin anymore. But here again is how he thinks. He writes in his book, he hears about the Narrows and how beautiful they are. He goes, sees them. They are beautiful. They're on private property. They're beautiful. He writes, "It is settled that these relations of the country people are entitled to any credit." They're ignorant. "The traveler who turns out of his way, often sent on a fool's errand. I was disappointed to find the Narrows of St. Francis well worthy of a visit. Even though he was seeing some of God's best work, he was disappointed because his theory about people being stupid was wrong." He's a complicated guy. He arrived back at the place. That was kind of a neat day. Jim Fisher led. This is kind of an interesting side note. While I was traveling, I'd come home about every 2 weeks to see my wife. I'd stage my truck about every 3 or 4 days and have somebody move it. We had 2 sets of keys, walked it. I got home 2 different times. There's a Jim Fisher's called, left his number. Actually kin somehow to you, right? Through marriage? Somewhat distant or something. I finally returned his call. Luckily, I returned it in time. This is the great-great-great-great-grandson of the Fisher that Fisher Holt took them to this place. Now, this was put up by, I think, Better Business, their local Rotary Club, to commemorate where those lead faucets were. The family that owned it about 30 years ago got tired of buses of children coming out to visit it, so they petitioned the state to move it. So this actually commemorating the spot's 2 miles from the spot. Now it came back, and I haven't been back there because COVID. I was going to interview people. I'm supposed to be writing a book, but I don't know, COVID's over. I just haven't. But now they wish they hadn't moved it because the railroad is about to just doze that all in and build another trestle because to make 2 lines rather than 1. And when the poor guy keeps telling them, but this is a historic place, they just looked at him and said, sir, we got maps. We've been up there. The historic place is 2 miles from here. So this probably, I haven't been back there in 5 years. It's probably gone now, the historic place. This monument's probably still sitting up there 2 miles away. Met some neat people on the walk. Saw some pretty places. Biggest thing, and I mean to be writing a book about it, the biggest thing that I want to do, this was, that day that I was talking about that we get bullets. I don't know what we're being shot at, but bullets were coming our direction. Actually, when we turned around and left, they were kicking dirt up about 20 feet in front of us. We were walking down this path, and this was the note. I don't know if you can read it. This way, dummy. Now, I'm only thinking that was probably left there by the guy for some of his fellow hunting companions to find the deer stand. Got to name some stuff, some deer. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it. I got back to my truck one day. It topped out that afternoon at 1 degree. I didn't know that this was almost a real problem. I didn't know there were locks, and none of my maps said there's locks. So I'm coming down the river in a john boat. And again, I can't get it to play. But anyhow, if it would play, there's like locks with dams and stuff, and I just almost drifted right up on there. I had a lot of adventures. Performed one wedding during it. I was privileged to preach a sermon at an old Mount Zion church in Shannon County. Finished a children's book. This was just kind of a joke. I never carried that much stuff. I just did that picture for a mock-up. Sadly, some people saw it and thought, wow, that had to be heavy. Ozark Heritage Project is just an organization I run. I've got a few books for sale from some other writings. Any questions? At all about me or Schoolcraft? I don't know everything, but I know a fair amount about him. I can't think of that gal's name, but they had Uncle Tom, then Aunt Jane maybe or something it just became known as. We're all familiar, the movies and the plays and all that. We're very familiar with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom. But there were numerous books of that genre written back then for sale in the North, but there were almost as many written and sold in the South that were basically, and his second wife was one of those authors, in fact, one of the more popular authors, that the books were showing you how great it was to be a slave. So, yeah. Any questions at all? If not, thank you. How many books did he write? 5, 6? How many did he write? Yes. Oh no, I think he's got 37 in print. Do what now? Well, he went up north because of this, helped discover the true source, not on the government trip, but later the true source of the Missouri. But Mississippi rather, I'm sorry. But he went to work as the Indian agent in Michigan, first as a territory, later a state. He spent 30-some years up there north, and he wrote the definitive. He has a 6-volume. He wrote numerous books, but he also has a 6-volume that his wife helped him complete. He died very poor, very sick. The last few years, mostly bedridden. But he wrote the lawsuit I alluded to Longfellow, the poem Hiawatha. 2 years before Longfellow wrote the poem Hiawatha, Henry Schoolcraft wrote a can't think of the right word, but a collection of Indian tales, and Hiawatha was like the second in the book, had its own chapter. Now, and I was kinder to him than he probably was, because we have no real evidence that he ever owned up to the fact, except for his wife's writing. He got the story Hiawatha from his wife, and she was a fine writer in her own right. I have not read any of her stuff because it hasn't been translated, because it's been written in Ojibwe, and nobody's done translation. But he wrote, but counting the 6 volumes, counting just numerous, but most of them were about Indian culture, Indian legends and stuff. Most of them were about that, and most of them were set up in the North. Most of them set up in the North. He wrote 2 books about this. So he wrote this one with that huge title, and then I can't remember the name of the other one, but he wrote it like 12 years later, basically just rewrote the same book from his notes with a different name and a few more details. Because in the first book, he doesn't name his horse. He doesn't even allude to the fact he had a horse, I don't think. In the second book, he does, and his name was Butcher. A very complex guy. Truly, he hoped to serve his Lord, but he wanted fame and money. But he just never, like I said, even I get a 25-year-old, but when he rewrote the book 15 years later, he still didn't get that it was just providence he wasn't killed, and it was people's kindness that he lived that he called ignorant. And he's got just numerous passages in both books about these dirty people. In one of them, I can't remember which one, he describes these children and dogs running out towards them. And he said, due to their stench and level of filth and grime, it's hard to tell the animals from the children. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. I've got handouts for you. I'm going to put this down. I forgot that. I'm going to turn this off. This is just kind of a little bit of a synopsis with some of the books you can get. Okay? Almost forgot them. And kind of a little bit of a synopsis of the trip. There you go. You bet. Thank you. Well, they got somebody else coming on soon, so I need to get out here. What time is it? Oh, okay. If anybody's got any questions, I'll be glad to stay around until another guy shows up and answer. Okay, a comment, yes. Oh, okay. So you're familiar with all that. You're probably familiar with some of the history, I would hope. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I had a wonderful welcome at their museum when I came in. That there was one of the pictures on there was when I came in. In fact, that was another neat call I got. This lady called and said, I need to buy you dinner, when you come into town. And I said, I want to eat. And I said, I can buy my own dinner. She said, no, I need to feed you dinner. Well, she was there's the guy's name, Eric Fuller, right here. And he does, if you go to Small and Cave, he is their resident Schoolcraft presenter. But he stepped back and played Levi Pettibone that day. Just a remarkable man. Just a remarkable. Anyhow, there's where I came in, all those. And there's are you familiar with this? Nothing to do with Schoolcraft, but some of these people there are part of the Batesville Historical Society. Just a few years previous, they had built an old, I can't remember if it's just a large, I can't remember if it's a paddle boat or what, but anyhow, it was one of the larger boats. And they'd historically not only built it as they were, but built it with the old tools. And they had a bunch of people show up for its maiden voyage. And they had the press there. And of course, so dignitaries start showing up, and you don't say no to governors and senators and all that. Long story short, they overloaded it, didn't get like 50 yards from the bank, and it sank. Now, they saved it, but and a couple of these guys were actually on it trying to tell people, guys, this is too many. You can't say no to a senator and a senator's friend, senator's family, But anyhow, this gal that had been calling me that bought me dinner, She was the great-great-great-granddaughter of the widow Lafferty that Henry Schoolcraft and Levi had eaten with 200 years to the day. So 200 years to the day, I was fed a meal by the descendant of the widow Lafferty within miles of where the cabin was. The cabin's long gone, and we actually ate at some pizza place where you can kind of order all your own. You know, you don't make it yourself, but it's a pretty. I mean, you can ask for everything. You know, you can just But that was neat. So, like I say, there were days I was exactly where I knew he was. There were some days if you're going down a valley, and I didn't even cover this, but like in his book, he'd say, that's why they have that pretty accurate map, and Curtis Copeland since then made even more accurate. But, I know, as did Levi Pettibone, on really rough terrain, I can cover 2 miles an hour. On good terrain, I cover 4 miles an hour walking, even with a 60-pound pack. So I just look at my watch if I'm on rough terrain, and this is a replica, but this is just like the compass he had. What they do is you would find a rock formation, maybe a lone pine tree or something, and so you'd walk towards it. You'd see what direction you're walking. You'd see how long you walked, and so that way you could with pretty much confidence say I walked, southwest 8 miles Tuesday, October, whatever, or not October, November, but So that's how that's how I did much of mine, But any other just comments? It is, like I say, kind of a peeve of mine because there is no excuse in 2016 or 17 to Google Missouri Explorers and not have that map in that museum in St. Louis. I mean, there's just no, other than government workers. But government workers, I kind of have a thing with them because during the walk, a man that worked for our tax dollar, for the Missouri Department of Conservation, he was posting on Facebook, and he actually had the period costume. He actually had I went to the period costume. At first, I started out in modern stuff. I kept modern shoes and modern underwear the whole way. But I started wearing, because all you had to do was just get a copy of Rafferty's book, and it was online, sadly. I wish more people had bought it because his widow's still alive. He gets a small royalty. But all you had to do is get a copy of that book, and you could, Tuesday, here's where he's going to be. And it was kind of surreal, kind of funny. I'd be just walking down a dirt road, and there'd be people out there in their Jeeps to see me. One guy on a cross-country bike because I was what they called bushwhacking, and I wasn't familiar with that term. Somebody about the second week out, some news agency said, "Are you bushwhacking any?" Now, no, I'm bringing my own stuff. I mean, bushwhacking is knocking the guy in the head, but bushwhacking is hiking off-grid, I didn't know that. Well, this guy did know it, and he knew where I approximately had to be, so he'd been riding around a trail bike for 2 hours trying to find me. Some of these, like I said, some of these old paths became roads. I came down one road, and I think you picked me up that evening or something, but I came down one road up near 67 because he wasn't always on 67. There's some deviation. I think I passed 4 houses that actually had their kids out there in their Sunday best to take their picture with Henry Schoolcraft. So that made the day longer. I was glad to do it, but I mean so that's kind of neat. I mean, I actually had some longer days too because I encountered private property. He didn't. And one of my memorable days was in Christian County, north of Springfield. I was supposed to walk 13 miles, I walked 26, I think, because I kept hitting. And I had an app in my little Garmin that told me who owned it and how many acres. And at that time, they were available they had a chip from Missouri and Colorado. There's only 2 chips, but Garmin, And so and then if I'm looking at a sign that says trespassers to be shot, I walked around and then I had to, I was given the privilege. It wasn't on Christmas Day because he had 2 weeks off. And I had 2 weeks off. We actually went out to the Smokies and I hiked some. Yeah. Fireman's holiday, they call it or something. But I had the privilege of delivering the message to Mount Zion Church, which was built back in the 40s and closed in the 60s. And the government owns it now. We're trying to get it back. We have services there occasionally. I got to deliver the message here that day. So I didn't pass that up. But it took me off, not only off trail, but 3 hours highway off trail. So when I got done, I had to drive 3 hours, and I had to walk all night to get back on schedule. So I had some, and then I had a wedding I performed. I had a few book signings. One of the memorable was down near, I think it's in Arkansas. It wasn't Batesville, but somewhere down in there. And the first part, I mean, I've got a column in 30-some newspapers, and several of them are near that first part. So when people knew me, a lot of people just Dent County, I used to log, used to fox hunt, so they knew me. So I just, like I'd know somebody by name, they'd move my truck, where I'd get to it in like a week. I got down near Batesville and didn't know people. I was north of Batesville, coming to, and 2 college kids. And I said, I'll give you $20, and I showed them on the map where to park the truck. And they said, well, we don't want to take your money. I said, well, you guys are in college. I said, you can use money, no problem. Here, take my $20. I got the key, just lock the key in the truck. I got okay. So I walked that day, that night. It's cold. The next day, about 3 o'clock in the morning, it started getting sleet and snow. By afternoon, I'm down near zero, walking in just blizzard conditions. Can't wait to get to the truck. I get to the junction, no truck, no cell service, which maybe was good because I was dreading calling my wife because it's her truck. And so I walk another 2 or 3 miles. It's past dark. I realized I've got to put up for the night. So I got in under some cedar trees, built very little fires, and just tried to keep from freezing to death. And that was my biggest. People have asked the challenges, other than almost drowning a time or two or freezing. I processed with I had this camp axe. I also had what I call a bow saw, but it's just these little fold-out delimbing saws like bow hunters use. I was processing probably half a quart of wood a day to stay warm. Because I'd have a hot meal for lunch. Because my doctors I have several, yes, a cardiologist, a pulmonologist. None of them said, yeah, do that. Of course, like I remind them, they couldn't stop me. But they had suggestions, and one of them was to stretch out every morning, stretch out again at noon, stretch out before I go to bed at night, and eat 3 hot meals. And then, of course, you needed the fire to stay warm. I found out quickly you couldn't stay in a tent because you can't heat it, not with what I was carrying. But anyhow, that night I did something, didn't freeze, got back up the next day, and I'm thinking, they've stole my truck. They've stole my truck. About noon, 12 miles past where the truck was supposed to be, there's the truck. Well, I'd jump in it, start it up, run the heater, get into my, and that's one of the things I do miss. I was probably consuming 8,000 calories a day because I could, between walking and shivering and processing wood. Now I still try to consume 2,000 or 3,000, and obviously I can't. But they leave the note, and I don't think they're being smart aleck. I just think that's how young minds today work. They said, we felt bad about taking your money to move your vehicle 12 miles. So we moved it 24. Now, I almost died because of them, but I don't think they're big jerks. I need to go. Okay. 5 minutes. Okay. Are you the next guy? I'm the next guy. I'll get out of your way, buddy.